Recovered survey records from fractured vault sites, xenological excavation pits, and sealed transcript archives describe the same pattern with unusual consistency. Investigators note corridors that do not obey ordinary geometry, threshold chambers that appear larger from within than from without, and gate structures whose internal surfaces respond to psychic pressure, not mechanical force. In damage-picked feeds, the light inside such passages is diffuse but directionless, as if illumination exists without a visible source. Audio logs speak of pressure changes without wind, motion without engines, and distances that contract or lengthen depending on route and intent. Human observers, Aeldari witnesses, and later Imperial analysts disagreed on terminology, but the functional conclusion remained similar. They were not describing a ship, a city, or a weapon in the conventional sense. They were describing a transit architecture older than most civilizations still remembered by name. The subject of those reports was the Webway. In accepted lore, the Webway is not simply a tunnel network cut through normal space. It is better understood as a hyperdimensional construct set between the material universe and the warp, touching both while fully belonging to neither. This distinction matters because the Webway performs the strategic function of faster-than-light travel without exposing its users directly to the full predatory instability of the warp. Its passages vary dramatically in scale. Some are narrow enough for individuals or small squads moving on foot. Others are broad arterial routes capable of admitting vehicles, war machines, or even large vessels. Because of that range, the Webway is not a single road, but a layered system of paths, nodes, hidden branches, sealed dead ends, transport nexuses, and ancient portals distributed across the galaxy in patterns that do not resemble normal territorial mapping. Descriptions of the Webway often stress that it behaves like an engineered circulation system. Research and other summaries repeatedly refer to arteries, capillaries, and branching passages, which is useful language because the structure seems to have grown by accumulation and linked expansion rather than by one unified build phase. In visual terms, accounts describe glowing corridors, impossible gradients, suspended bridges, vault chambers, and enclosed roads of psycho-reactive substance. The passages are real enough to be crossed, defended, damaged, and sealed, yet their wider arrangement does not translate cleanly into the spatial logic of Realspace. A route that appears adjacent in the network may emerge light years away. A local nexus can connect to multiple distant regions while remaining invisible to nearby civilizations that lack the means to detect or open its gates. The deepest origin of the Webway lies before the rise of the Aeldari Empire. Standard lore traces its first construction to the Old Ones, the ancient civilization credited with creating or shaping many of the galaxy's most consequential technologies and species during wars of extreme antiquity. The Aeldari did not originate the Webway, but they inherited knowledge of it and eventually became its greatest masters. This distinction is important because later ages often speak of the Webway as though it were an Aeldari possession in absolute terms. In practical use, that is partly true. In historical origin, it is not. The structure predates the mature Aeldari dominion, and even at the height of that dominion, the network was old, immense, and not fully transparent even to those who relied on it. Once the Aeldari civilization rose to galactic prominence, the Webway became one of the foundations of its power. It enabled movement across vast interstellar distances without the same navigational hazards faced by species dependent on warp translation. That gave the Aeldari Empire extraordinary strategic reach. Trade, migration, military deployment, political communication, and cultural exchange could pass through secured routes and nodal cities embedded inside or attached to the network. Comoro itself developed into the greatest such nodal metropolis by the 18th millennium, becoming less a single city than an aggregation of linked subrealms and districts rooted deep inside Webway space. In that era, control of portals and internal routes mattered as much as control of planets. The Empire could project force without announcing its approach through conventional space, which made the Webway both infrastructure and civilizational backbone. Construction and development within the Webway were unlike ordinary civil engineering. The surviving descriptions imply a blend of psychic architecture, hyperspatial design, warding systems, and materials resistant to warp intrusion. The network was protected by complex psychic barriers, and in some eras the Aeldari are said to have used devices such as reality engines to alter or manipulate portions of the Webway's fabric. This suggests that the system was not merely occupied, but actively maintained and reshaped over time. It also explains why later civilizations could imitate aspects of Access technology, such as portals or breach mechanisms, yet struggle to reproduce the original resilience of the network itself. The Webway's architecture was not only advanced, it was deeply integrated with metaphysical principles that most later powers understood only in fragments. At the level of physical encounter, entry into the Webway usually depends on a portal or gate, rather than on ordinary transit engines. Aeldari lore repeatedly refers to Webway gates scattered across the galaxy, remnants of the lost empire that still connect craft worlds, hidden enclaves, and strike routes to the labyrinth dimension. Every craft world is described as maintaining a nexus of such gates for travel. In military use, smaller-scale portal devices allowed forces to emerge unexpectedly onto battlefields, which is one reason Aeldari warfare often appears abrupt, precise, and difficult for human commanders to predict. The Webway does not simply shorten travel time, it changes the operational grammar of movement itself. Armies no longer need to approach along obvious axes. They can arrive from a gate thought dormant, from an interior route not charted by the enemy, or from a localized portal generated by rare specialist equipment. Even in its more intact eras, however, the Webway was never a perfectly safe public road. Lore sources describe abandoned branches, collapsed ways, sealed portals, predatory regions, and mazes capable of trapping travelers who lack proper knowledge. Present-day Aeldari are explicitly said not to understand the Webway in its full original shape or extent. Some routes are lost, others are secret by design, their locations guarded by seers, harlequins, or specialized custodians. This partial ignorance matters because it prevents the Webway from functioning as a clean technological solution. It remains powerful, but it is fragmented power. Much of its utility depends on inherited maps, guarded traditions, specialized intuition, and access to lineages of knowledge that were never fully democratized. In other words, the Webway survived its maker's supremacy, but not their total command of it. The catastrophe that transformed the Webway from a pan-imperial transport matrix into a damaged and contested labyrinth was the fall of the Aeldari. As the old empire collapsed under the psychic and moral excess that culminated in the birth of Slaanesh, the shock ruptured countless pathways. Large parts of the network were damaged, broken open, or made impassable. Warp breaches infected sections that had once been secure. Entire branches became dead zones, killing grounds, or sealed horrors. Some populations survived inside those depths and changed with them. The Drukhari endured by making their home within the surviving parts of Comora and its adjoining subrealms, while Harlequins retained an almost unique mobility across dangerous routes and continued to guard hidden knowledge, including access to the Black Library. The fall, therefore, did not destroy the Webway outright, but it permanently ended its condition as a stable Imperial commons. One of the most important details in later history is that the Webway could still tempt non-Aeldari powers because its value remained enormous. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor of Mankind undertook the Webway project, a secret effort to gain human access and ultimately reduce or replace reliance on warp travel. According to summaries, the project was not merely about logistics. It was part of a larger ambition to shield humanity from chaos and redirect its future development as an increasingly psychic species. Beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, a portal connected through the Golden Throne was used to create or extend human passages into the Webway. The Mechanicum even created a specialized caste known as the Unifiers to construct these new sections. Yet the human-built tunnels were inferior to the original network, lacking the same psychically resistant materials and protections. That distinction between original and reconstructed sections reveals a lot about the Webway itself. It was not enough to discover an entrance. The challenge was preserving stability against metaphysical intrusion. Human engineering could force an opening, brace a route, and hold it temporarily, but it could not easily replicate the ancient sophistication of the true network. The eventual disaster came when Magnus the Red's warning to Terra tore open breaches that let warp entities invade the human sections. What followed became the war within the Webway, a prolonged and devastating conflict fought in secret while the wider Horus heresy consumed the Imperium. The need to hold shut the human gate helped trap the Emperor upon the Golden Throne thereafter. For Chapter 1, that future consequence matters because it shows the Webway was not just old Xenos infrastructure, it became one of the hidden load-bearing structures of Imperial history itself. From the standpoint of development then, the Webway passed through several major conditions. It began as an ancient construct of the Old Ones. It became a mastered and expanded transit civilization under the Aeldari. It fractured under the Fall. It persisted in broken but still potent form through Craftworld, Drukhari and Harlequin use. It then drew the attention of the Emperor, whose attempt to adapt it for humanity ended in secret catastrophe. None of these phases erase the earlier ones. All remain present in the structure's current character. That is why the Webway in later ages can contain pristine monumental passages beside warped ruins, hidden libraries beside raiding routes, and zones of elegant design beside branches sealed off against demonic corruption. It is not a relic in the sense of something inert. It is an old system still in use, but no longer whole. Its outward construction reflects that layered history. Some gates appear as wraithbone arches or monumental portal structures aligned with Aeldari design principles. Some internal regions read as roads, galleries, and open chambers. Others resemble fortified transit spines built for movement rather than habitation. There are city spaces inside it, but the Webway itself is not reducible to a city. There are routes broad enough for fleets, but it is not simply a naval lane. There are hidden paths that may only admit a handful of travellers, which makes it useful not only for Empire but also for infiltration, assassination, intelligence movement, and survival after collapse. That range of scales is one of its defining features. A structure that can support both civilization and ambush will always shape the character of those who rely on it. There are also persistent hints in the lore that the Webway does not behave entirely according to ordinary causality. Some traditions claim it extends not only across space, but in peculiar relation to time, with remote locations where time reverses or does not flow normally at all. Such details are not central to everyday use, and the Aeldari themselves are described as having treated temporal experimentation with caution. Even so, the existence of these accounts reinforces the broader point that the Webway is not a machine in the simple industrial sense. It is an engineered metaphysical environment. Its roots can be measured tactically, but its deeper totality resists complete reduction to map logic. This is one reason it remains such a durable subject of fear, fascination, and failed imitation in later ages. For an initial chapter devoted to lore accuracy, the clearest conclusion is that the Webway should be understood first as foundational infrastructure and only second as mystery. It enabled one of the greatest civilizations in galactic history to move, rule, and survive beyond the limitations imposed on lesser powers. It preserved enclaves after that civilization broke. It shaped the rise of Comora, the mobility of Craftworld forces, the secret labor of Harlequins, and the most ambitious hidden project ever attempted by the Emperor. At every stage, its significance came from a simple but overwhelming fact. Whoever could use the Webway could cross the galaxy with a degree of speed, discretion, and strategic freedom that conventional warp travel could never safely match. That made it priceless long before humanity knew it existed, and catastrophic once humanity tried to claim it. The Webway's most defining trait is its position between states of existence. It is neither fully anchored in Realspace nor fully immersed in the warp, but instead occupies a protected dimensional layer that interfaces with both. This placement is not incidental. It is the core reason the network functions as it does. By existing adjacent to the warp rather than within it, the Webway allows transit at speeds comparable to or exceeding warp travel, while avoiding the most destructive consequences of direct exposure to the immaterium. Travellers within its passages are not subjected to the same level of demonic predation, temporal distortion, or navigational uncertainty that defines conventional warp translation. The environment is not perfectly safe, especially in damaged sections, but it is fundamentally more stable than the warp itself. This stability is achieved through structural and metaphysical properties that distinguish the Webway from any known Imperial or Mechanicus construct. The passages are composed of a substance often associated with psycho-reactive materials, most commonly described in relation to wraithbone. This material does not behave like inert matter. It responds to psychic input, reinforcing the idea that the Webway is both engineered and sustained through principles that merge physical design with controlled warp interaction. The internal surfaces of the corridors are smooth, often luminous, and capable of maintaining form against external pressure that would otherwise collapse a conventional tunnel carved through hyperspace. The implication is that the Webway is not merely hollowed space, but a self-contained environment with its own rules of cohesion. In terms of structural variation, the Webway exhibits a wide range of scales and configurations. Narrow passages exist that can only accommodate individuals or small groups, forcing movement on foot or through light transport. These smaller corridors often branch unpredictably, forming maze-like regions where orientation depends on knowledge rather than visibility. Larger arteries, by contrast, are broad enough to support vehicles, armoured columns, or significant logistical movement. Some routes have been recorded as wide enough to admit large craft, though this remains dependent on the specific segment and its state of preservation. Between these extremes are intermediary corridors, chambers, junctions, and open spans that serve as staging grounds, defensive points, or transition zones between major routes. The network is not continuous in the sense of a single uninterrupted system. It is instead composed of interconnected segments, some active, some sealed, and others lost entirely. Portals act as access points between Realspace and the Webway, and these gateways vary in size, complexity, and function. Permanent gates, often constructed with Aeldari design principles, can link major nodes such as craft worlds or internal cities. These structures are stable and capable of repeated use, provided they remain intact and uncontested. Smaller or temporary portals can be generated through specialized technology, allowing localized entry and exit under controlled conditions. The existence of both fixed and flexible access points gives the Webway a level of operational adaptability that conventional transport networks cannot replicate. Another distinctive trait is the way distance operates within the Webway. Movement through its corridors does not correspond directly to linear travel through real space. A short journey within the network can translate to vast distances across the galaxy, while a seemingly long internal route may emerge relatively close to its point of origin. This non-linear relationship between internal traversal and external displacement is one of the system's most valuable characteristics. It allows users to bypass conventional geographic constraints, effectively collapsing distance through dimensional routing rather than raw speed. The exact mechanics of this process remain poorly understood outside of Aeldari tradition, but its practical effect is consistently observed in recorded use. Temporal behaviour within the Webway is generally more stable than in the warp, but it is not entirely uniform. Most passages maintain a consistent flow of time relative to Realspace, which is essential for reliable travel and coordination. However, there are documented instances of anomalous regions where time behaves irregularly. These areas are typically avoided, sealed, or treated as hazards by those who possess sufficient knowledge of the network. While such anomalies are not the defining feature of the Webway, their existence reinforces the idea that the system operates on principles beyond standard physical laws. From a defensive standpoint, the Webway is inherently resilient but not invulnerable. Its walls are resistant to warp intrusion under normal conditions, acting as a barrier that prevents the full manifestation of demonic entities. This protection is one of the primary reasons it was so valuable to the Aeldari and later to those who sought to exploit it, However, the network can be breached. Damage sustained during the fall of the Aeldari introduced regions where the barrier between the Webway and the warp has weakened or collapsed entirely. In these areas, the environment becomes hostile, unstable, and in some cases indistinguishable from a contained warp incursion. These compromised zones are often abandoned or actively avoided, though some factions have adapted to operate within them. Navigation within the Webway is a specialized discipline. Unlike warp travel, which relies on navigators and the Astronomicon for orientation, Webway traversal depends on knowledge of routes, access to accurate maps, and in many cases psychic intuition. The network's complexity means that a lack of guidance can lead to disorientation, entrapment, or unintended emergence in hostile territory. Aeldari forces mitigate this risk through inherited knowledge, seer guidance, and cultural familiarity with the system. Other factions, lacking this depth of understanding, face significantly higher risks when attempting to use or access the network. In terms of specifications, the Webway does not conform to standardized measurements in the way Imperial technology does. There is no single set of dimensions, capacities, or performance metrics that define it universally. Instead, its specifications must be understood as a range of capabilities. Transit speed is effectively instantaneous relative to Realspace distances, limited more by route availability and access points than by movement itself. Capacity varies from narrow corridors to expansive arteries capable of sustaining large-scale movement. Durability is high in intact sections, with structural integrity maintained over millennia, but significantly reduced in damaged or corrupted regions. Maintenance, where it occurs, is performed through methods that combine physical repair with psychic reinforcement, processes that are not fully replicable by non-Aeldari civilizations. The use case of the Webway reflects these traits. For the Aeldari, it serves as the primary means of strategic movement, allowing rapid deployment across vast distances without reliance on warp navigation. This enables a style of warfare characterized by precision, speed, and unpredictability. Forces can appear with minimal warning, execute targeted objectives, and withdraw before a conventional response can be organized. Beyond military applications, the Webway supports communication, trade, and cultural exchange between distant enclaves, maintaining cohesion across a fragmented civilization. For the Drukhari, the Webway is not only a transit system but also a habitat. Comora and its surrounding subrealms exist within the network, using its depth and complexity as both shelter and expansion space. This use case demonstrates the Webway's capacity to support large, permanent populations, though such habitation is dependent on control of stable regions and the ability to defend against internal and external threats. Harlequins utilize the Webway as a means of near unrestricted movement, acting as messengers, guardians, and agents who traverse routes that others cannot. Their use of the network highlights its role in preserving knowledge and maintaining hidden connections across the galaxy. Their access to restricted paths and their ability to navigate dangerous regions further emphasize the importance of specialized knowledge in exploiting the Webway's full potential. For the Imperium, the Webway represents an unrealized alternative to warp travel. The Emperor's attempt to integrate humanity into the network through the Webway project illustrates both its perceived value and the difficulty of adapting it to human use. The project's failure underscores a key limitation. Access alone is not sufficient. Without the means to maintain structural integrity and resist warp intrusion at the level achieved by the original builders, any attempt to replicate or expand the Webway risks catastrophic instability. In a broader sense, the Webway functions as a force multiplier for any faction capable of using it effectively. It compresses distance, reduces exposure to warp hazards, and enables forms of movement that conventional strategies cannot easily counter. At the same time, its fragmented state, partial accessibility, and inherent risks prevent it from becoming a universal solution. It remains a powerful but incomplete system, shaped as much by its limitations as by its capabilities. Across all known uses, one principle remains consistent. The Webway does not replace the need for strategy, knowledge, or control, it amplifies them. Those who understand its routes, maintain its access points, and navigate its dangers gain a decisive advantage. Those who do not are as likely to be lost within it as they are to benefit from its existence. The users of the Webway are defined less by ownership and more by access, knowledge, and survivability. No single faction in the current age possesses full control over the network. Instead, it is occupied, traversed, and contested by multiple groups whose relationship with it varies from mastery to partial exploitation. Among these, the Aeldari remain the most consistent and capable users, though even they operate within limits imposed by loss, fragmentation, and incomplete understanding. The craft-world Aeldari rely on the Webway as a primary method of strategic movement. Their vessels are equipped with gate access points that connect directly into stable segments of the network, allowing them to deploy forces rapidly across interstellar distances. This method of travel reduces reliance on warp navigation and minimizes exposure to chaos. Aeldari war hosts typically emerge through pre-existing gates or controlled portals, execute precise operations and withdraw before sustained engagement can occur. This pattern of use shapes their entire doctrine. Mobility is not simply a convenience. It is the foundation of their survival strategy in a galaxy dominated by larger, more numerous forces. Individual Aeldari who operate within or alongside the Webway display a range of physical and behavioral characteristics consistent with their roles. Guardians and aspect warriors, depending on specialization, are generally of lithe build, with heightened reflexes and perceptual acuity. Their armor integrates with their movement rather than restricting it, and their weaponry emphasizes precision and lethality over brute force. Seers, who play a critical role in navigation and decision-making, exhibit heightened psychic sensitivity, often accompanied by signs of age that reflect experience rather than decline. These individuals do not simply travel through the Webway. They interpret it, using foresight and inherited knowledge to avoid dangerous routes and identify optimal pathways. The Drukhari, by contrast, use the Webway as both sanctuary and dominion. Their primary population centre, Comora, exists entirely within the network, expanding across multiple connected subrealms. This environment is not a single unified city, but a composite of districts, enclaves, and territories governed by competing factions. The Drukhari exploit the Webway's depth and obscurity to conduct raids into Realspace, capturing resources and prisoners before retreating beyond conventional pursuit. Their use of the network is aggressive and opportunistic, relying on speed and unpredictability. Unlike the craft-world Aeldari, who treat the Webway as infrastructure, the Drukhari treat it as territory to be controlled, exploited and defended against rivals. The Harlequins occupy a distinct position within the Webway's user hierarchy. They are not tied to a single location or population centre, and instead move freely across the network's most dangerous and restricted paths. Their role includes the preservation of knowledge, the protection of hidden sites such as the Black Library, and the maintenance of routes that others cannot safely traverse. Harlequins are characterized by extreme agility, precise combat capability, and a level of situational awareness that reflects deep familiarity with the Webway's structure. Their presence reinforces the idea that access to the network is not only a matter of technology, but of cultural and experiential inheritance. Beyond the Aeldari, access to the Webway becomes significantly more limited and hazardous. The Imperium of Man has only achieved partial and largely unsuccessful interaction with the network. The Emperor's Webway project represented the most ambitious attempt to integrate humanity into this system. Specialized personnel, including mechanicum engineers and genetically or psychically adapted workers, were tasked with constructing human-made extensions within the Webway. These individuals operated under extreme conditions, facing environmental instability and the constant threat of warp breach. Their efforts demonstrate that human use of the Webway is possible in principle, but requires levels of protection and understanding that the Imperium has not been able to sustain. Other factions have encountered or attempted to exploit the Webway in isolated instances, but consistent use remains rare. The network's access points are not widely known, and those that are known are often heavily contested or deliberately concealed. Even when entry is achieved, the lack of reliable navigation and the presence of damaged or hostile regions make sustained use difficult. As a result, the Webway remains functionally dominated by those who inherited its knowledge rather than those who discovered it later. The effects of the Webway on its users are both practical and psychological. On a practical level, it enables rapid, covert movement across vast distances, altering the balance of power in any engagement where it is effectively employed. Forces that can utilize the Webway gain the ability to choose when and where to engage, often bypassing defensive lines and logistical constraints. This creates a form of asymmetrical advantage that is difficult to counter without equivalent access or predictive capability. Psychologically, the Webway imposes a distinct form of strain. While it is more stable than the warp, it is not entirely neutral. The absence of conventional environmental cues, the presence of non-linear spatial relationships, and the awareness of surrounding hazards can affect perception and orientation. Experienced users adapt to these conditions, developing an intuitive sense of direction and distance that compensates for the lack of familiar reference points. Inexperienced individuals, by contrast, may experience disorientation, anxiety, or impaired decision-making. In extreme cases, particularly in damaged sections, exposure can lead to physical harm or loss due to environmental instability or hostile entities. The network's damaged state introduces additional effects. Regions compromised by warp intrusion exhibit conditions that deviate sharply from the stable norm. These areas may contain fluctuating geometry, unpredictable temporal behavior, and active demonic presence. Entry into such zones is generally avoided unless required by circumstance or undertaken by groups capable of managing the associated risks. The existence of these regions reinforces the importance of root knowledge and the dangers of uncontrolled exploration. From a broader perspective, the Webway influences the strategic and cultural development of its primary users. For the Aeldari, it supports a doctrine of precision and mobility that compensates for their reduced numbers. For the Drukhari, it enables a predatory mode of existence based on rapid incursion and withdrawal. For the Harlequins, it provides the means to fulfill roles that depend on secrecy, speed, and access to hidden knowledge. In each case, the network is not merely a tool but an environment that shapes behavior and decision-making. The final fate of the Webway is not a single event, but an ongoing condition defined by fragmentation and contested use. It was not destroyed during the fall of the Aeldari, but it was permanently altered. Large portions of the network remain intact and operational, supporting continued use by surviving Aeldari factions. Other sections are damaged, sealed, or lost, their original routes inaccessible or unknown. The human-built extensions created during the Webway project were compromised and effectively abandoned following the incursion that accompanied the Horus Heresy, leaving only the sealed portal beneath the Imperial Palace as a reminder of that effort. In its current state, the Webway persists as a partially functional system. It continues to provide critical advantages to those who can access it, but it no longer offers the universal reliability it once did. Its fragmentation ensures that no single faction can dominate it completely, while its inherent complexity prevents easy replication. It remains a network of immense strategic value, balanced by equally significant risk. There is no definitive conclusion to its existence within the known timeline. It has endured the collapse of a galactic empire, the rise of another, and multiple large-scale conflicts that reshaped the structure of the galaxy. Its continued operation suggests a level of resilience that exceeds most other ancient constructs. At the same time, its damaged sections and incomplete accessibility indicate that it is not immune to decay or further disruption. In practical terms, the Webway's fate is tied to the factions that continue to use and interact with it. As long as the Aeldari maintain their knowledge and access, and as long as key portals remain functional, the network will persist as a critical but incomplete element of galactic infrastructure. Whether it can ever be restored to its original state remains unknown. No current faction possesses the full knowledge or capability required to achieve that outcome. The Webway therefore stands as both a remnant of past mastery and a living system still shaping present conflict. It is not a relic in decline, nor a tool fully understood. It is an enduring structure whose significance has outlived its creators, continuing to influence the movement, strategy, and survival of those who can navigate its depths. Fragmented administratum, transcripts, and Mechanicus observation logs describe the Webway not as a singular discovery, but as a recurring anomaly encountered across multiple theatres and eras. Early Imperial records rarely identify it by name. Instead, they refer to non-warp transit vectors, Xenos gate networks, or impossible corridor phenomena. These descriptions originate from battlefield reports, exploratory expeditions, and post-engagement analyses where Imperial forces observed hostile or unknown entities appearing and withdrawing without detectable warp translation signatures. The absence of conventional warp disturbance was noted repeatedly as the defining irregularity. Initial impressions recorded by the Adeptus Administratum were inconsistent, largely due to the limited context available to Imperial observers. In several documented campaigns, entire Aeldari strike forces emerged within secured zones without prior warning, bypassing perimeter defences and void surveillance. Administratum tacticians attributed these events to either advanced stealth insertion or localised teleportation. However, repeated occurrences across different war zones forced a re-evaluation. The pattern did not align with known Imperial or heretical technologies. The conclusion, reached gradually rather than decisively, was that a separate form of transit existed, one that allowed entry into Realspace without detectable warp translation. Mechanicus records provide a more technical interpretation, though they remain constrained by incomplete data. Explorator teams encountering Webway gates describe them as stable, self-sustaining structures with no visible power source in the conventional sense. Surface analysis indicates materials resistant to both thermal and kinetic degradation, as well as to low-level warp interference. Attempts to interface with these structures using standard Mechanicus protocols have produced limited results. The gates do not respond to mechanical input alone. Activation appears to require specific energy signatures, psychic interaction, or encoded sequences beyond current Imperial understanding. In controlled observations, dormant gates have remained inert despite sustained efforts to stimulate a response. In other instances, gates have activated spontaneously in the presence of Aeldari forces, suggesting that access is governed by criteria not easily replicated. Mechanicus analysts have noted that the internal surface of an active gate does not display a conventional interior. Instead, it presents a semi-luminous field with no measurable depth until entry is achieved. Probes inserted into this field have returned inconsistent readings, often failing to transmit data beyond a certain threshold. This has led to the working hypothesis that the gate interface acts as a dimensional transition point rather than a physical aperture. Strategic observations recorded by the Administratum emphasize the operational implications of this system. Forces utilizing the Webway demonstrate a consistent advantage in initiative. Engagements begin without warning, often within what Imperial doctrine would classify as secure or rear areas. Defensive fortifications designed to counter orbital or ground-based assault prove ineffective against insertion points that bypass conventional approaches. Administratum analysts have identified this as a critical vulnerability in Imperial defensive doctrine, one that cannot be addressed through reinforcement of existing perimeter systems alone. Further observations highlight the variability of Webway usage across different Aeldari factions. Craftworld forces tend to employ the network for targeted strikes and rapid redeployment, minimizing exposure and avoiding prolonged engagement. Their use of the Webway is disciplined and structured, with clear operational objectives and withdrawal protocols. By contrast, Drukhari forces exhibit a more opportunistic pattern, using the network to conduct raids focused on resource acquisition and capture of personnel. Their incursions are less predictable in timing and location, complicating efforts to anticipate or counter their movements. Mechanicus data logs also note the existence of internal environments within the Webway itself. While direct exploration remains limited, recovered sensor data and survivor accounts describe corridors, chambers, and junctions that maintain structural integrity independent of real space. These environments exhibit stable atmospheric conditions in intact sections, suggesting that they are not merely transitional spaces but fully enclosed domains. However, reports also indicate the presence of unstable regions where structural cohesion has degraded, leading to exposure to warp phenomena. These areas are classified as high risk and are typically avoided by all known users. Attempts by the Mechanicus to map the Webway have been largely unsuccessful. The network's non-linear structure prevents the creation of accurate spatial representations using conventional methods. Routes that appear consistent in one instance may lead to different exit points in another, depending on variables that are not yet understood. This has led to the conclusion that navigation within the Webway is not solely dependent on spatial orientation, but may involve additional factors such as psychic alignment or encoded pathway recognition. From a strategic perspective, the Webway is assessed as a force multiplier of significant magnitude. Its ability to enable rapid, covert movement across interstellar distances allows its users to dictate the terms of engagement. Administratum projections indicate that widespread access to such a system would fundamentally alter the balance of power within the galaxy. However, the same projections also acknowledge that the risks associated with uncontrolled use are equally substantial. The presence of damaged sections, potential for entrapment, and unknown environmental hazards introduce variables that cannot be fully mitigated with current Imperial capabilities. Mechanicus evaluations of the Emperor's Webway project provide additional insight into these risks. Records indicate that while initial access was achieved through the Golden Throne interface, the constructed passages lacked the resilience of the original network. Structural instability and vulnerability to warp intrusion were identified as critical weaknesses. The subsequent breach, resulting in sustained incursion by warp entities, confirmed that partial replication of the Webway without complete understanding of its underlying principles is not viable. This event is classified within Mechanicus archives as a failure of both engineering and containment. Observations of Webway-related phenomena have also influenced Imperial strategic doctrine in more indirect ways. Commanders operating in regions with known or suspected gate presence are advised to maintain flexible defensive formations and rapid response units capable of addressing internal threats. Static defenses are considered insufficient in isolation. Intelligence gathering efforts prioritize the identification and monitoring of potential gate locations, though the reliability of such efforts is limited by the concealed and variable nature of these structures. In summary, the combined impressions of the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus present the Webway as a system of exceptional capability paired with equally significant uncertainty. It is recognized as a method of transit that circumvents the limitations of warp travel, providing its users with unparalleled strategic mobility. At the same time, its operation depends on factors that remain outside the scope of Imperial science and engineering. The network cannot be reliably mapped, its access points cannot be consistently controlled, and its internal conditions cannot be fully predicted. The prevailing conclusion within these records is not one of dismissal or denial, but of constrained acknowledgement. The Webway exists, it functions, and it confers decisive advantages to those who can use it. However, until its principles can be understood and replicated without catastrophic failure, it remains beyond the practical reach of the Imperium. As such, it is treated not as an asset to be integrated, but as a variable to be accounted for in all engagements involving Aeldari forces or other entities suspected of possessing access to its pathways. Mechanicus construction records concerning the Webway are defined by a repeated pattern of partial success, followed by systemic failure. Unlike conventional Imperial engineering projects, which rely on standardized materials, predictable stress tolerances, and replicable processes, attempts to construct or extend Webway pathways encountered variables that could not be isolated or controlled through known methodologies. The Emperor's sanctioned effort beneath Terra remains the most detailed example. There, Mechanicum cohorts, supported by specialized labor units and guided by direct oversight, attempted to fabricate human-accessible corridors connected to an existing Webway nexus. Initial progress demonstrated that entry points could be stabilized and that limited expansion into adjacent dimensional space was possible. Structural frames could be established, and passageways could be formed that maintained temporary integrity. However, these constructed sections displayed critical deficiencies when compared to the original network. The materials available to the Mechanicum, while advanced by Imperial standards, lack the psycho-reactive properties attributed to Aeldari wraithbone and similar constructs. As a result, the fabricated corridors required continuous reinforcement, both mechanical and psychic, to prevent degradation. Energy consumption for maintenance exceeded projected thresholds, and structural cohesion showed signs of instability under prolonged stress. Most significantly, the artificial passages proved vulnerable to warp intrusion. Without the inherent resistance observed in original Webway structures, even minor breaches escalated rapidly, compromising entire segments. Manufacturing findings recorded during this period indicate that the Webway's durability is not solely a function of material composition, but of integrated design principles that combine physical architecture with controlled interaction with the immaterium. Mechanicus analysts concluded that the original builders possessed a level of understanding that allowed them to create barriers capable of isolating the Webway from warp turbulence while still permitting controlled transit. In contrast, Imperial constructions acted as incomplete barriers, allowing pressure from the warp to accumulate until containment failed. This distinction rendered long-term human replication unviable with existing knowledge. Additional attempts to study Webway construction through recovered gate fragments and dormant portals yielded limited insight. Surface analysis confirmed the presence of materials resistant to conventional degradation, but efforts to replicate these materials through Forge World processes were unsuccessful. The internal structure of gate components did not conform to known manufacturing techniques. Instead, they appeared to be grown or formed through processes involving psychic shaping rather than mechanical assembly. This observation reinforced the conclusion that the Webway is not a product of industrial fabrication in the traditional sense, but of a hybrid methodology combining engineering with controlled psychic expression. Recorded use cases compiled by the Adeptus Administratum focus primarily on battlefield encounters and strategic anomalies. In multiple campaigns, Imperial forces reported sudden emergence of Aeldari units within fortified zones, followed by rapid withdrawal through localized distortions consistent with Webway portal activation. These incursions were characterized by precise targeting of command elements, supply depots, or critical infrastructure. The duration of engagement was typically brief, often concluding before Imperial forces could reorganize an effective response. Administratum analysts identified this pattern as a form of strike capability that bypasses conventional lines of engagement, rendering traditional defensive depth less effective. In addition to offensive applications, the Webway has been observed supporting logistical movement for Aeldari forces. Reports indicate that Craftworld fleets utilize gate networks to reposition without reliance on warp translation, allowing for sustained operational flexibility. This capability extends to evacuation scenarios, where populations or assets can be relocated rapidly in response to emerging threats. The absence of warp exposure reduces the risk of navigational error and temporal distortion, providing a level of reliability not achievable through standard Imperial methods. Administratum and Mechanicus evaluations converge on a consistent assessment. The Webway represents a transport system that, if fully understood and controlled, would exceed the strategic value of all existing Imperial transit methods combined. Its primary benefit is the ability to traverse interstellar distances without reliance on warp translation. This removes dependence on navigators, eliminates the requirement for continuous astronomical alignment, and significantly reduces exposure to warp-related hazards. In purely logistical terms, it offers a model of movement that is faster, more predictable, and less resource-intensive over sustained operations. From a strategic standpoint, The Webway provides a level of initiative control that conventional forces cannot easily counter. Administratum projections indicate that a force capable of consistent Webway deployment could conduct simultaneous operations across multiple sectors with minimal transit delay. Reinforcements could be redirected in near real time, supply lines could be shortened or bypassed entirely, and evacuation or redeployment could occur without the delays associated with warp travel preparation and navigation. This compresses operational timelines and increases the tempo of warfare beyond the limits currently imposed on Imperial doctrine. Another identified benefit is the reduction of attritional loss during transit. Warp travel carries inherent risks, including navigational error, temporal displacement, and direct exposure to hostile entities. The Webway, in intact sections, mitigates these risks by providing a contained environment isolated from the most volatile aspects of the immaterium. Mechanicus records note that this stability would improve the reliability of long-distance movement for both military and civilian purposes, reducing losses that are currently accepted as unavoidable within Imperial logistics. In addition to mobility, the Webway offers potential advantages in communication and coordination. While not designed as a communication network in the conventional sense, its structure allows for the rapid movement of messengers or data carriers across vast distances. This could enable more synchronized operations across dispersed fleets and armies, addressing one of the Imperium's most persistent challenges. Administratum analysts have identified this as a secondary but significant benefit, particularly in large-scale campaigns where coordination delays can determine outcomes. Despite these advantages, the recorded costs associated with Webway utilization and attempted replication are substantial. The Emperor's Webway project serves as the primary case study. Mechanicus logs detail the allocation of extensive resources, including specialized labor forces, rare materials, and continuous energy input to maintain structural integrity. The construction of human-made passages required constant reinforcement, both mechanical and psychic, to prevent collapse. This level of resource expenditure exceeded initial projections and proved unsustainable without direct oversight and intervention at the highest levels. The most critical cost, however, is not material, but existential. The failure of the human-constructed sections demonstrated that incomplete understanding of Webway principles leads to catastrophic vulnerability. The breach that occurred during the project allowed warp entities to enter and propagate within the constructed network, transforming it from a controlled environment into a contested war zone. The subsequent conflict required continuous containment efforts, ultimately resulting in the permanent occupation of the Golden Throne as a stabilizing mechanism. This outcome is classified as a strategic failure with long-term consequences for the Imperium. Mechanicus assessments emphasize that the cost of failure in Webway replication is disproportionately high compared to other technological endeavors. While conventional projects may result in localized damage or loss, Webway-related failures have the potential to create persistent breaches that compromise entire regions. The inability to fully contain such breaches without extraordinary measures introduces a level of risk that current Imperial doctrine deems unacceptable for large-scale implementation. There are also operational costs associated with attempting to utilize existing Webway structures. Access points are limited, often concealed, and frequently contested by hostile forces. Securing and maintaining control over a gate requires sustained military presence and the ability to defend against both external assault and internal threats emerging from the network itself. Administratum records indicate that even when a gate is identified and secured, its long-term reliability cannot be guaranteed due to the variable condition of connected pathways. Navigation within the Webway introduces additional constraints. Without the inherited knowledge and psychic capabilities of the Aeldari, Imperial forces lack reliable methods for route selection and hazard avoidance. This increases the likelihood of misnavigation, entrapment, or unintended emergence in hostile environments. Mechanicus attempts to develop autonomous navigation systems have been unsuccessful, as the network's non-linear structure does not conform to standard mapping or predictive models. From a maintenance perspective, the Webway presents a paradox. Intact sections require minimal intervention, having remained stable over millennia. However, once damaged or artificially modified, they demand continuous input to prevent degradation. This creates a scenario in which the Imperium can neither fully maintain nor safely ignore compromised segments. Any attempt to repair or expand these areas risks further destabilization, while neglect allows existing damage to persist or worsen. The benefits and costs outlined in these records lead to a measured conclusion within both Administratum and Mechanicus archives. The Webway is acknowledged as a system of unparalleled strategic value, capable of redefining the parameters of interstellar movement and warfare. At the same time, it is recognized as a system that cannot be safely replicated or fully controlled with current Imperial knowledge and technology. As a result, the prevailing doctrine does not advocate for renewed large-scale construction efforts. Instead, it emphasizes monitoring, containment, and opportunistic utilization where feasible. Identified gates are to be catalogued and observed, with engagement protocols adjusted to account for potential Webway-based incursions. Direct attempts to expand or integrate the network into Imperial infrastructure are classified as high risk and are subject to strict limitation. In conclusion, the Webway occupies a unique position within Imperial strategic assessment. It is neither an asset nor a purely external threat, but a persistent variable that influences both. Its existence provides certain factions with capabilities that exceed those of the Imperium, while its inaccessibility highlights the limitations of current Imperial science. The balance between these factors defines the Imperium's approach. It must account for the Webway's impact without relying on its benefits, and it must recognize its potential without underestimating its dangers. The final determination within these records is not one of rejection, but of restraint. The Webway remains a subject of study and a target of interest, but it is not a system that can be brought under Imperial control without consequences that outweigh its advantages. Until such time as its underlying principles can be fully understood and applied without introducing systemic risk, it will remain beyond the practical reach of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the administrative framework of the Imperium. Inquisitorial records concerning the Webway begin not with confirmation, but with contradiction. Early dossiers compiled across multiple ordos contain reports that do not align with established models of warp activity. Entire units vanish without trace, yet no empiric disturbance is detected. Enemy forces appear within secured perimeters, but no translation signature precedes their arrival. Surveillance picks record distortions that cannot be classified as teleportation, warp breach, or technological cloaking. These anomalies were initially categorized as isolated irregularities, often attributed to faulty instrumentation or unverified Xenos capabilities. Only after repeated occurrences across separate sectors did the pattern become difficult to dismiss. Inquisitors assigned to investigate these anomalies describe a consistent absence. The warp is not present in the expected form. There are no tides of immaterial energy, no psychic turbulence, no residual echoes that typically accompany warp-based intrusion. Instead, there is a form of displacement that leaves a minimal trace, as if movement has occurred outside the detectable spectrum of Imperial observation. This absence becomes the primary indicator. Where there should be evidence of transition, there is none. Where there should be disruption, there is silence. Subsequent investigations focus on the points of emergence. These locations often correspond to areas of historical or Xenos significance, including ancient ruins, sealed vaults, or regions previously identified as containing Aeldari artifacts. In several documented cases, Inquisitorial teams arriving at such sites have encountered inactive structures resembling gate frameworks. These constructs display no immediate function, yet their design suggests purpose. When active, they do not open in a mechanical sense. They shift, presenting a surface that appears to recede into depth without measurable distance. Entry into such a field results in immediate loss of external contact. Observations from agents who have entered these structures are rare and frequently incomplete. Those who return describe environments that do not correspond to real space. Corridors extend beyond visible limits, yet can be traversed in durations that defy proportional measurement. Light exists without source, and sound behaves inconsistently, sometimes carrying across distances without attenuation, other times failing to transmit at all. The absence of environmental decay in intact sections contrasts sharply with regions where structural failure has occurred. In these compromised areas, the boundary between the webway and the warp appears weakened, allowing intrusion by entities that would otherwise be confined to the immaterium. Inquisitorial analysis identifies this duality as a defining characteristic. The webway is not uniformly stable. It contains both secure and compromised regions, and the transition between them is not always clearly marked. This introduces a level of unpredictability that complicates any attempt at controlled exploration. Routes that are safe at one time may become hazardous without observable cause. Sections believed to be sealed may reopen, while known passages may collapse or become inaccessible. Conspiracy findings within Inquisition archives extend beyond simple observation. Several ordos have proposed that the webway is not merely a remnant of Xenos technology, but an active domain of influence maintained by entities or factions operating beyond Imperial oversight. The continued functionality of certain routes, despite the broader degradation of the network, suggest ongoing maintenance or selective preservation. Harlequin activity is frequently cited in this context. Their ability to traverse regions inaccessible to other Aeldari factions, combined with their role as custodians of hidden knowledge, has led to speculation that they actively manage portions of the network to serve purposes not fully disclosed. Other theories focus on the Emperor's involvement and the implications of the Webway project. Inquisitorial records acknowledge that the Golden Throne functions as more than a life support system. It is also a containment device, preventing further incursion from a breached Webway section beneath Terra. This has led to speculation that the Imperium is already partially embedded within the Webway, though in a state of forced isolation. Some Inquisitors argue that the continued operation of the Golden Throne is not only preserving the Emperor's physical form, but also maintaining a barrier that prevents the collapse of adjacent pathways into the warp. There are also less substantiated claims regarding hidden human access points beyond Terra. Fragmentary reports suggest that certain rogue elements, including heretical factions or unsanctioned explorers, have discovered minor gateways and attempted to exploit them. These accounts are often dismissed due to lack of verification, but their persistence across multiple archives has led to cautious consideration. If true, they would indicate that the Webway is not entirely beyond human reach, but that such access is sporadic, dangerous, and largely uncontrolled. Inquisitorial observations also address the behavior of entities encountered within compromised sections. Demonic manifestations within the Webway differ in certain respects from those encountered in open warp space. Their forms appear constrained by the surrounding structure, and their ability to propagate is limited by the integrity of the local environment. This suggests that while breaches allow entry, the Webway itself imposes restrictions on warp entities that do not exist in the immaterium. This containment effect is not absolute, but it represents a critical distinction that may have been an intentional feature of the original design. The psychological impact of Webway exposure is another area of concern. Agents operating within the network report a persistent sense of dislocation, even in stable regions. The absence of familiar spatial and temporal cues affects perception and decision-making, particularly over extended durations. In compromised areas, this effect is amplified by the presence of warp influence, leading to hallucinations, temporal confusion, and in some cases complete cognitive breakdown. Inquisitorial protocols for Webway exploration emphasize strict time limits and continuous monitoring to mitigate these risks. From a conspiracy perspective, the most significant finding is the possibility that the Webway represents a contested domain rather than a neutral space. Multiple factions utilize it, but none appear to exert total control. This raises the question of whether there are deeper layers of the network that remain inaccessible even to known users. Some Inquisitors speculate that the original architects may have embedded safeguards or hidden structures that continue to influence its operation. Others suggest that unknown entities, possibly predating even the Aeldari, may still exert influence over certain regions. These theories remain unconfirmed, but they are not dismissed outright. The Inquisition's approach to the Webway is defined by caution and controlled skepticism. It acknowledges the limitations of current knowledge while remaining open to the possibility that the network's true nature extends beyond what has been observed. Each new encounter is treated as both a data point and a potential anomaly, requiring verification and cross-reference against existing records. In summary, the Inquisition's impressions of the Webway are shaped by absence, inconsistency, and partial revelation. It is a system that operates outside the expected parameters of both real space and warp space, presenting opportunities for rapid movement and hidden activity, while also concealing threats that cannot be easily detected or contained. Observations confirm its existence and functionality, but they do not provide a complete understanding of its structure or purpose. The conspiracy findings, while varied in credibility, converge on a central theme. The Webway is not fully abandoned, nor is it fully understood. It is a domain where knowledge is fragmented, control is contested, and the boundary between observation and speculation remains uncertain. For the Inquisition, this combination of factors elevates the Webway from a subject of interest to a matter of ongoing concern, requiring continued investigation and strict containment of any unauthorized interaction. Interrogative records compiled by multiple ordos approach the Webway through testimony rather than theory. Survivors, captives, sanctioned psychers, and recovered operatives form the primary data sources, though consistency across these accounts remains limited. Subjects with direct exposure to the network often describe similar structural features but differ in interpretation. Corridors are reported as smooth, continuous, and self-supporting, yet their perceived scale varies depending on the observer. Some describe enclosed passages with clear boundaries, while others report open expanses that appear to extend indefinitely. When questioned under controlled conditions, several subjects indicate that distance within the Webway cannot be reliably measured using conventional reference points. Movement that should require extended time is completed rapidly, while other routes appear to prolong transit without visible cause. Psycho interrogations provide additional, though less stable, data. Sanctioned individuals exposed to the Webway frequently report a diminished presence of warp resonance compared to real space environments. This absence is not interpreted as safety, but as suppression. The immaterium is still present in proximity, but its influence is restricted. Inquisitorial analysts note that this suppression is uneven. In intact regions, psychic activity is dampened to a manageable level, allowing controlled use of abilities without immediate risk of possession. In compromised areas, however, this suppression fails. Psychers report sudden surges of warp energy, accompanied by disorientation and loss of control. These fluctuations are often cited as indicators of structural instability within the network. Interrogations of captured Drukhari and Aeldari individuals yield more precise but less forthcoming information. When compelled to provide navigational details, subjects consistently emphasize the importance of route knowledge and the danger of deviation. They describe the Webway as a system of known paths rather than an open environment. Unauthorized exploration is presented as highly dangerous, with a significant probability of encountering dead ends, collapsed sections, or hostile regions. Attempts to extract comprehensive maps have been unsuccessful. Subjects either lack complete knowledge or refuse to disclose it, reinforcing the conclusion that no single user possesses full understanding of the network. Anomaly reports collected by the Inquisition expand on these findings. Several documented cases describe temporal inconsistencies experienced by agents operating within the Webway. In one instance, a reconnaissance unit entered a gate and returned with mission logs indicating a duration of several hours, while external observers recorded only minutes. In another case, an operative reported extended exposure within the network, yet showed minimal physical signs of elapsed time upon extraction. These discrepancies are not universal, but their recurrence suggests that certain regions of the Webway exhibit altered temporal flow. Spatial anomalies are also recorded. Agents describe junctions that appear identical, yet lead to different destinations depending on the route taken. Some passages have been observed to shift configuration between entries, altering the expected layout without visible structural change. These observations have led to the hypothesis that the webway is not entirely static. Its internal geometry may be influenced by factors beyond physical construction, including psychic activity or unknown control mechanisms. More severe anomaly reports involve direct interaction with compromised sections. In these regions, the boundary between the webway and the warp is weakened or absent. Agents entering such areas report immediate environmental degradation, including fluctuating light levels, distortion of sound, and the presence of entities consistent with demonic classification. Unlike open warp encounters, these entities appear partially constrained by the surrounding structure. Their movement is limited, and their ability to manifest fully is reduced. However, this constraint does not eliminate the threat. Engagements within these areas result in high casualty rates, and containment is often impossible without withdrawal. One notable report details a partial collapse of a webway segment during an Inquisitorial incursion. The passage exhibited signs of structural failure prior to collapse, including visible fractures along its surface and irregular fluctuations in illumination. As the failure progressed, sections of the corridor disintegrated, exposing adjacent warp space. The resulting breach allowed multiple entities to enter, forcing immediate evacuation. The site was subsequently classified as non-recoverable, and access was sealed where possible. This incident is frequently cited as evidence that the webway's integrity, while durable, is not absolute. Beneficial findings identified by the Inquisition are acknowledged but treated with caution. The primary advantage remains the ability to bypass warp travel, reducing exposure to chaos and improving transit reliability in stable sections. In controlled operations, limited use of known safe routes has allowed rapid deployment of small teams for reconnaissance or targeted intervention. These missions demonstrate that the webway can be utilized effectively under strict conditions, provided that accurate route information is available and exposure time is minimized. Another potential benefit is the containment effect observed within intact regions. The suppression of warp influence creates an environment where certain psychic phenomena can be studied with reduced risk. Inquisitorial research units have proposed the use of isolated webway segments for controlled experimentation, though such proposals are subject to strict oversight due to the inherent dangers involved. The possibility of leveraging this containment effect for defensive purposes has also been considered, particularly in relation to limiting demonic manifestation. Detrimental findings, however, outweigh these benefits in current assessments. The primary concern is the unpredictability of the network. Routes cannot be assumed to remain stable, and environmental conditions can change without warning. This unpredictability introduces a level of risk that cannot be fully mitigated through existing protocols. Even well-planned operations are subject to failure if conditions within the webway deviate from expectations. Interrogations of captured Drukhari and Aeldari individuals yield more precise but less forthcoming information. When compelled to provide navigational details, subjects consistently emphasize the importance of route knowledge and the danger of deviation. They describe the webway as a system of known paths rather than an open environment. Unauthorized exploration is presented as highly dangerous, with a significant probability of encountering dead ends, collapsed sections, or hostile regions. Attempts to extract comprehensive maps have been unsuccessful. Subjects either lack complete knowledge or refuse to disclose it, reinforcing the conclusion that no single user possesses full understanding of the network. Anomaly reports collected by the Inquisition expand on these findings. Several documented cases describe temporal inconsistencies experienced by agents operating within the webway. In one instance, a reconnaissance unit entered a gate and returned with mission logs indicating a duration of several hours, while external observers recorded only minutes. In another case, an operative reported extended exposure within the network, yet showed minimal physical signs of elapsed time upon extraction. These discrepancies are not universal, but their recurrence suggests that certain regions of the webway exhibit altered temporal flow. Spatial anomalies are also recorded. Agents describe junctions that appear identical, yet lead to different destinations depending on the route taken. Some passages have been observed to shift configuration between entries, altering the expected layout without visible structural change. These observations have led to the hypothesis that the Webway is not entirely static. Its internal geometry may be influenced by factors beyond physical construction, including psychic activity or unknown control mechanisms. More severe anomaly reports involve direct interaction with compromised sections. In these regions, the boundary between the Webway and the warp is weakened or absent. Agents entering such areas report immediate environmental degradation, including fluctuating light levels, distortion of sound, and the presence of entities consistent with demonic classification. Unlike open warp encounters, these entities appear partially constrained by the surrounding structure. Their movement is limited, and their ability to manifest fully is reduced. However, this constraint does not eliminate the threat. Engagements within these areas result in high casualty rates, and containment is often impossible without withdrawal. One notable report details a partial collapse of a Webway segment during an Inquisitorial incursion. The passage exhibited signs of structural failure prior to collapse, including visible fractures along its surface and irregular fluctuations in illumination. As the failure progressed, sections of the corridor disintegrated, exposing adjacent warp space. The resulting breach allowed multiple entities to enter, forcing immediate evacuation. The site was subsequently classified as non-recoverable, and access was sealed where possible. This incident is frequently cited as evidence that the Webway's integrity, while durable, is not absolute. Beneficial findings identified by the Inquisition are acknowledged but treated with caution. The primary advantage remains the ability to bypass warp travel, reducing exposure to chaos and improving transit reliability in stable sections. In controlled operations, limited use of known safe routes has allowed rapid deployment of small teams for reconnaissance or targeted intervention. These missions demonstrate that the Webway can be utilized effectively under strict conditions, provided that accurate route information is available and exposure time is minimized. Another potential benefit is the containment effect observed within intact regions. The suppression of warp influence creates an environment where certain psychic phenomena can be studied with reduced risk. Inquisitorial research units have proposed the use of isolated Webway segments for controlled experimentation, though such proposals are subject to strict oversight due to the inherent dangers involved. The possibility of leveraging this containment effect for defensive purposes has also been considered, particularly in relation to limiting demonic manifestation. Detrimental findings, however, outweigh these benefits in current assessments. The primary concern is the unpredictability of the network. Routes cannot be assumed to remain stable, and environmental conditions can change without warning. This unpredictability introduces a level of risk that cannot be fully mitigated through existing protocols. Even well-planned operations are subject to failure if conditions within the Webway deviate from expectations. The psychological impact on personnel is another significant factor. Prolonged exposure to the Webway environment results in cumulative stress, even in stable regions. Agents report difficulty maintaining orientation, reduced situational awareness, and impaired judgment over time. In compromised areas, these effects are intensified by warp influence, leading to hallucinations, paranoia, and in some cases, complete loss of cognitive function. Inquisitorial guidelines therefore restrict the duration of Webway operations and require continuous monitoring of personnel condition. The risk of contamination is also documented. Agents returning from compromised sections may carry residual warp influence, even if no immediate symptoms are present. Quarantine and purification protocols are mandatory following such missions, and several cases have resulted in termination of affected individuals to prevent further spread. This reinforces the assessment that interaction with the Webway, particularly in damaged areas, carries risks comparable to direct warp exposure. In conclusion, Inquisitorial interrogative findings and anomaly reports present the Webway as a system of controlled potential and uncontrolled variables. It offers measurable advantages in mobility and containment under specific conditions, but these advantages are offset by significant and often unpredictable risks. The network's partial stability, combined with its fragmented and evolving structure, prevents it from being classified as either safe or entirely hostile. The Inquisition's position reflects this balance. The Webway is not rejected outright, as its benefits are too substantial to ignore. However, it is not embraced as a reliable tool, as its dangers remain insufficiently understood. All interaction is therefore governed by strict limitation, with emphasis on containment, observation, and controlled use. Any expansion of engagement beyond these parameters is considered a potential threat to both operational integrity and broader Imperial security. Inquisitorial priority notices concerning the Webway are issued under conditions of restricted circulation, often attached to incidents where standard containment doctrine has proven insufficient. These notices do not attempt to redefine the network. They focus on immediate risk indicators and escalation thresholds. The most consistent urgent finding is that Webway activity can occur without precursor signals detectable by conventional auspex, astropathic relay, or warp disturbance monitoring. This absence of warning invalidates early response assumptions built around detection. By the time a manifestation is confirmed, the incursion has already begun. Operational records therefore redefine contact as the first observable effect rather than the moment of entry. This includes sudden loss of internal communication, localized structural distortion, or the appearance of hostile entities within secured zones. Inquisitorial directives emphasize that delay between anomaly recognition and response must be minimized. Units are instructed to treat unexplained internal breaches as active incursions regardless of origin confirmation. Waiting for verification increases casualty probability and reduces containment effectiveness. Warning signs associated with active or imminent Webway interaction are catalogued across multiple reports. Environmental irregularities are the most common indicators. These include shifts in ambient light without source alteration, localized temperature variance unlinked to mechanical systems, and acoustic anomalies where sound either fails to propagate or travels beyond expected range. Structural indicators include the appearance of smooth, non-manufactured surfaces intersecting with existing architecture, often forming arch-like or circular configurations. These formations may remain inert for extended periods before activation. Psychic indicators are less consistent but equally significant. Sanctioned psychers report a reduction or distortion of warp resonance in affected areas, sometimes accompanied by a sensation of pressure or absence rather than presence. This deviation from baseline psychic conditions is treated as a potential precursor to Webway activity. In compromised zones, the inverse may occur, with sudden spikes in warp energy indicating breach conditions within an already unstable segment. Behavioral changes in personnel are also noted as early indicators. Individuals operating near potential access points may exhibit disorientation, impaired spatial awareness, or difficulty maintaining focus. These symptoms can occur prior to any visible anomaly, suggesting that the Webway's influence extends beyond its immediate physical boundaries. Inquisitorial protocols require immediate evaluation and, if necessary, isolation of affected personnel to prevent escalation. Urgent findings also address the issue of unauthorized access. Reports confirm that minor gateways can exist outside of known or monitored locations. These gateways may be dormant, partially concealed, or mistaken for non-functional Xenos structures. Activation can occur through unknown triggers, including proximity of specific individuals, psychic interaction, or external manipulation. Once active, these gateways provide direct access to the network, bypassing all conventional defenses. Inquisitorial doctrine classifies any unidentified structure matching known gate characteristics as a potential high-risk asset, requiring immediate investigation and, if feasible, containment or destruction. The presence of compromised Webway sections introduces additional warning conditions. Areas exhibiting structural instability, visual distortion, or irregular illumination are treated as potential breach zones. Entry into such regions is prohibited without explicit authorization and specialized support. Historical records indicate that even brief exposure can result in rapid escalation, including collapse of local structure and incursion of warp entities. The transition from stable to compromised conditions can occur without clear boundary markers, increasing the risk of inadvertent exposure. Inquisitorial conclusions regarding the Webway are defined by layered caution rather than definitive resolution. The network is acknowledged as a persistent and active system with significant influence on galactic events. Its capacity to enable rapid, covert movement remains unmatched by Imperial technology. At the same time, its fragmented state and variable integrity prevent it from being classified as a stable or controllable environment. Strategic analysis within Inquisition archives emphasizes that the Webway should be treated as a contested domain rather than a passive structure. Multiple factions utilize it, each with differing objectives and levels of access. This creates a dynamic environment where control of specific routes or nodes can shift over time. Inquisitorial observers note that certain pathways appear to remain consistently active and maintained, while others degrade or become inaccessible. The criteria governing these changes are not fully understood, leading to speculation that elements of the network may be subject to ongoing manipulation or selective preservation. The role of the Golden Throne remains central to Inquisitorial interpretation. It is recognized as both a containment mechanism and a point of vulnerability. The continued necessity of its operation suggests that the breach beneath Terra has not been fully resolved. Some records propose that the Imperium's stability is partially dependent on maintaining this containment, linking the fate of the Emperor directly to the integrity of a localized Webway interface. This connection elevates the network from a peripheral concern to a factor of existential significance. Final conclusions within Inquisition documentation avoid absolute statements. The Webway is not classified as inherently hostile, nor is it considered a viable asset for unrestricted use. It occupies an intermediate category defined by potential utility and persistent threat. Engagement with the network is permitted only under controlled conditions, with strict adherence to containment and monitoring protocols. The overarching directive is one of vigilance. The Webway cannot be eliminated and it cannot be fully secured. Its existence must therefore be accounted for in all strategic planning, particularly in operations involving Aeldari forces or regions with known Xenos activity. Failure to consider its influence introduces variables that cannot be compensated for through conventional means. In practical terms, the Inquisition's stance is clear. The Webway is to be observed, contained where possible, and utilized only with full awareness of the associated risks. Any deviation from these principles is treated as a potential threat to Imperial stability. The network's complexity, combined with its incomplete understanding, ensures that it will remain a subject of ongoing investigation and concern. The final assessment does not resolve the Webway's nature. It reinforces its status as an enduring unknown. It is a structure that enables movement beyond the limits of Realspace, resists full comprehension, and persists despite the collapse of the civilization that once mastered it. For the Inquisition, this combination of attributes defines the Webway as a phenomenon that must be respected, monitored, and approached with sustained caution, rather than one that can be fully controlled or safely ignored.